Welcome to the third section of this course. In this section, we will study models in depth and we will see how we can work with advanced relationships between them. We're going to start this section with something simple. We will see how we can restrict the length of a string value in the database. We will then see how we can set up a primary key both implicitly and explicitly. Then we will find out about alternate keys and how they can help us define unique fields. Moving on, we will look into how we can include and exclude values, how to work with database generated values, and what shadow properties are. We will, of course, dedicate quite a bit of time studying relationships and foreign keys. Let's begin this section by restricting the length of string values in the database. Pretty simple, right? With all the information that it needs to produce a solid database. And you will also get your hands dirty with some code on restricting the length of a string field in a new database that we are going to be building in this section. First, let's get some very basic theory out of the way. The entity framework is called like that for a reason. In an MVC setting, you use models, but from the entity framework's perspective, a model is actually an entity. The word comes from domain-driven design, where an entity is a mutable object whose values can change, but its identity cannot. An attribute is not something new that EF Core brings. It's been present in C# programming for some time now. It is an expressive tag that comes before a method, a field, or a class and provides some extra information to the runtime. One way to enhance entities is by the use of attributes. The second way is through the Fluent API. The Fluent API is not an actual alternative to the attributes method. That means they are not mutually exclusive. As you will see soon, there are some things that you can only achieve through the use of the Fluent API, like declaring alternate keys. But enough theory. The best way to comprehend these methods is to see an example, so let's dive right into one. Throughout this video, we will be developing an application for a bookstore. So it is only natural that we are going to need a model for the books stored in the bookstore application. So I've set up an app, I've installed Entity Framework Core, and we can absolutely go ahead and create a new class that will be our book model. Click OK. And this is it. Our book model will, of course, going to need an ID for its primary key. Remember, this is an entity. It needs a primary key. We're going to need a string for the book's title. Every book has an author, of course. So another string. And let's keep this short for now. I'm also going to add an ISBN, which is, in case you don't know, it's like an identifier, a unique identifier for every book. Not in the database, like in the world. The next step, of course, is going to be adding the book model in a database set in our DBContext class. Of course, we need to include the model's namespace. Let's name this property books. And now we are ready to run and create the initial migration before we move on to specifying to restricting the length of several string values in the book model, which is exactly what this video is all about. But first, let's create a new migration. This is the migration file, of course. You can see that all string values, namely the author, the ISBN, and the title, use the maximum value for the length of the string in the database. So if I run update.database, update-database, we are going to have to wait for a bit until Entity Framework Core has set up the database. Remember, this is the first time that the database is initialized. Let's visit the SQL Server Object Explorer, make sure we refresh. Go to the databases. I've named this database Bookstore. I've placed that name in the app settings.json file, and if I search inside the books table, in the column section, we're going to see that indeed, like in the migrations file, all string fields are of type nvarchar of length max. We want to fix that. We want to restrict the title of the book to 32 characters max. We can do that with the MaxLength attribute. Remember, there are two ways to do this. One is with attributes, the other one is through the Fluent API. Let's do this with attributes. Don't forget to include the system component model data annotations namespace, otherwise attributes won't work. Let's add a new migration. Since we are restricting the maximum length of the title field, let's call this book title MaxLength. Migration will be quickly set up. If we check the migration file, it's right behind us. Let me run update database. And oops, it says build failed. What's going on here? Oh, there's a typo. It seems like I accidentally... Yeah, no worries. So if I run update database, and if we go to the SQL Server Object Explorer and refresh, we will see that indeed the title column will have its length restricted to 32 characters max. Now, how about we do the same thing for the ISBN field this time, although without using attributes? The other approach is using the Fluent API. Now, how do we use it? One idea that I find particularly interesting is to go to the definition of the DB context class and copy the onModelCreating method. And we can paste it to our app DB context class. Make sure to remove the remarks if you don't need them. And of course, this is no longer an internal virtual, it's an override. We are overriding this method. By copying it from the base class, we make sure to not misspell something. And we use the model builder for the entity called book and the property ISBN. You can also provide a string in this method, although I prefer the expression way, and has max length of 10. This way we are restricting the length of the ISBN field to 10 characters max using the Fluent API. Now let's go ahead and create a new migration for this change. Let's call it book ISBN max length. Entity Framework Core will quickly set up this migration, and you can check the migration file, see that the type is nvarchar10 this time, not nvarchar max, as we saw initially before we use either the attribute system or the Fluent API to restrict the length of our string values. And if we update the database and check the SQL Server Object Explorer, we will quickly see, let me refresh the SQL Server Object Explorer. And now, what will we witness inside the columns folder of our books table? We will see that indeed the title of the book will still have restricted length to 32 characters, while also the ISBN will be restricted to 10. And of course, that's exactly the case. You see the attribute way working together with the Fluent API for the same model. It is generally a very good practice to restrict the length of string fields in the database, because Entity Framework will use the restriction to optimize the database schema. The attribute we used to restrict the maximum length of the book's title value can also help with validation. So if a user of your application submits a form for a book with a title value longer than the one anticipated, you can choose to issue an error message.